Lucia Sahai, the managing editor of Four on the Rocks. Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. In today's episode, Philip Gorski of Yale University joins the Clements Center and the LBJ School Research Colloquium at the University of Texas to discuss the role of civil religion in American life.
So the United States is in the midst of a deep crisis. I think that we all feel that, some more acutely than others, of course. The crisis has many causes. There's the growing economic inequality that has led many Americans to lose faith in the American dream. There's the relentless assault on democratic norms and institutions by President Trump. And there is the never-ending culture war between secular progressives and religious conservatives, to name only a few of the causes. It's the culture wars that are going to be the focus of my talk today. They've been raging for the better part of 4 decades, the better part of my lifetime. Now, part of the conflict is about real issues, specifically gay marriage and abortion. And these are contentious issues, and I'm not going to pretend to resolve them here. But what I'd like to focus on is another source of the conflict that I think we could possibly resolve, and that is history. There are conservative cultural warriors who argue that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. And many of their left-wing opponents respond that it was founded as a secular democracy. My thesis is that both of these stories are wrong, or rather that they're half right, too one-sided, because our civic tradition has both sacred and secular sources. It's both civil and religious in origin, and that's one reason why I refer to it as our civil religion. And while some religion certainly can divide us, this one has more often united us, at least in the past. And I think that it could possibly help to bring greater unity again. It probably can't unite all of us, but maybe enough of us to truly restart our civic conversation and begin moving the country forward again. All right, so let's take a closer look at that history, and let's start where such histories often do, with the Puritans, namely with John Winthrop, the longtime governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. As you may know, shortly before he set sail for the New World in 1630, he gave a brief speech. "We have entered into a covenant," he said, "and if we live up to its terms, we shall be as a city on a hill. But if we don't," he warned, "we'll soon be brought low." Now, Winthrop did not mean that America will be singled out for special blessings. He wasn't saying, "God bless America." On the contrary, he meant that America will be placed under special judgment. What will we be judged for? Not economic prosperity, not military might, not winning. For our charity and self-abridgment, he said, for our meekness and unity. So there's the religious strand in Winthrop's vision. Here's the secular one. Quote, "No commonweal can be founded but by free consent." Commonweal being another word for commonwealth, which is another word for republic. Now, the original charter for the Bay Colony envisioned a for-profit commercial venture, not a Puritan experiment in self-government. By the terms of the original charter, only stockholders were to have political rights. Winthrop helped draw up a new constitution that extended political rights, not to all members of the community, to be sure, but at least to all white male church members, which at the time, an aristocratic age of monarchical government, was a pretty radical thing to do indeed. So from the very beginning, our civil religion had a sacred strand drawn from biblical religion and a secular strand taken from political philosophy. Of course, the Puritans themselves fell well short of their own ideals, not least in their dealings with the native peoples. But the ideals themselves, justice and liberty, are noble ones nonetheless. Now let's turn to the second founding of the United States, the American Revolution. Once again, we find a complex mixture of sacred and secular sources blended together. Take the Declaration and the Constitution. The Declaration famously proclaims that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The Constitution continues, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." Familiar words all, of course. Now, some interpreters have argued that the American Constitution is godless. And they're right insofar as the Constitution itself contains no mention of God. But the same cannot be said of the Declaration. It speaks explicitly of a creator, a God who made us all equal and who endowed us with our unalienable rights. So again, a mixture of the sacred and the secular. But isn't this a mixture of oil and water? So it may seem to some of us today, but not so to the founding generation. For them, biblical religion and democratic self-government fit together hand in glove. The touchstone text was 1 Samuel 8. Here's how they read it. When the Israelites requested a king, God gave them one, but only as a form of punishment. For what is a king but a false god, an idol? Self-governing republics are the form of government appropriate to a righteous people. They did not come up with this reading themselves, though. They borrowed it from medieval Judaism. Now, how widespread was this view, you ask? Well, I can say that it extended well beyond the ranks of Orthodox Christians. That much is for certain. Consider Benjamin Franklin, not exactly a Puritan, right? So here's his proposal for the national seal of the United States. That would be the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. Or consider that runaway bestseller of the Revolutionary era, Common Sense by Thomas Paine. He was no Christian, not even a deist, but here's how he argued for a republic. Quote, the prophet Samuel expressly disapproves of government by kings. For near 3,000 years, Israel was a kind of republic administered by a judge and the elders of the tribe. That is, until the Jews under a national delusion requested a king. So even two of the most skeptical of the founders regarded biblical religion and republican self-government as potentially complementary. And this is one of the peculiarities and specificities of America's republican tradition. Now, like the Puritans, again, the founders fell far short of their own ideals, as we know. The Declaration had loudly declared that all men are created equal, but the Constitution had tacitly downgraded African slaves to 3/5 of a person. So long as men was taken to mean free white men, of course, there was no contradiction. But as the abolitionist movement took hold, more and more Americans began to challenge this assumption. Now, some defenders of Southern slavery sought to do away with the contradiction by simply doing away with the Declaration itself. John C. Calhoun, the chief ideologue of the Southern slaveocracy, dismissed the claim that all men are created equal as a blatant falsehood. He wanted to strike a couple of phrases from the Constitution. What troubled Calhoun specifically was the phrase, "we the people of the United States." He thought it should read, "we the peoples of these United States." It was the people of each separate state that were sovereign, he said. He didn't believe in the United States as a sovereign nation at all. Now, of course, many white Northerners agreed with Calhoun as well, including at first the young Abraham Lincoln. Now, to be sure, the young Lincoln didn't like slavery, but he didn't believe in full racial equality either. Nor was he of the opinion that the federal government possessed the power to abolish slavery. So what changed his mind? In part, his own rereading of the founders' writings and of the founding documents. After months of study, Lincoln concluded that the spirit of those documents was contained in their preambles, and that the spirit sometimes overrode the letters contained in the articles. This meant, importantly, that the Declaration's claim that all men are created equal overrode the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. It also meant that the constitutional quest for a more perfect union ultimately trumped the sovereignty of the individual states, including on the question of slavery. Lincoln was not the only one to reach this conclusion, of course. The abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass was of the same mind, and indeed Douglass may well have been the one who changed Lincoln's mind on this particular point. Be that as it may, for Calhoun, the American covenant had one value, and one value only: freedom. For Lincoln, it had at least two. Free government, yes, but also racial equality. The United States had failed to live up to this creed, and the Civil War was its just punishment. Or so he concluded in these famous words from his second inaugural. Fondly do we hope, Fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it must still be said today. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. The Americans had broken their covenant, he argued, and the war was their punishment. What, I sometimes wonder, will be ours? Now, for a brief time, during Reconstruction, the United States pursued racial equality in a serious way, but with the election of Andrew Johnson, they quickly reverted to their old backsliding ways, as have we. But let's turn from Reconstruction to the Progressive era. A lot has changed in the meantime. Industrialization has made the United States into an economic powerhouse. Immigration has made it more religiously and culturally diverse. World War I has turned it into a global power. It had also resulted in massive social inequality, in a nativist backlash against Asian Americans, in an epidemic of lynchings, in imperialist misadventures overseas. In other words, the Progressive era was an awful lot like our own. And therein lies cause for hope as well as despair, because the Progressive era was also a period of deep civic renewal, a period when some thinkers revitalized our civil religious tradition by going back to some of its deepest sources, philosophy and theology. Let me start with the man who came to be known as America's philosopher, John Dewey. Born in Vermont, raised a Protestant, Dewey became a professor of philosophy at Chicago and then at Columbia. In the process, he lost his religion, but not his faith, at least not his faith in American democracy. Because for Dewey, American democracy was a kind of spiritual project, a kind of secular civil religion. In many ways, Dewey's political views anticipated and shaped those of today's secular progressives. Like them, he believed that increased federal power was necessary to safeguard democratic freedom. In an earlier America, he reasoned, an agricultural America, where property was more equally distributed, the power of the many had been sufficient to counterbalance the power of the few. But in the new America, an industrial America, property was so concentrated in the hands of the few that they could simply ride roughshod over the interests of the many. The only way that a balance between the few and the many could be restored, he continued, was if a democratic citizenry used the power of the state to counterbalance the power of the wealthy few. Democratizing freedom would involve tempering the capitalist economy with the powers of a national state. Dewey's version of secular progressivism drew heavily on ancient philosophy. In particular, it drew on and transformed the theory of constitutional balance originally set forth by Greek and Roman thinkers. Like the ancients, Dewey believed that a democratic constitution was a necessary condition for a successful republic, but by no means a sufficient one. Civic education was for him equally crucial. For Dewey, one purpose of public education was to form democratic citizens, not by indoctrinating them with some whitewashed hagiographic version of American history, but rather by instilling habits of democratic association, habits of experimentation, of cooperation, and of reflection. Civic education was not enough either, though. It had to be combined with what Dewey called a common faith. Now, for the ancients, that had meant a faith in the gods of the city. For most Americans, that had meant a faith in the God of the Bible, and for many Americans, it still does. But Dewey's was a secular faith, a faith in democracy, not just as a form of government, but as a proposition about the cosmos. Dewey argued that democracy is inscribed in nature itself. So for him, the democratic project was a spiritual project as well as a political one, and in the fullest sense. Let's now turn from America's philosopher to America's theologian, and Dewey's contemporary, Reinhold Niebuhr. Born and raised in a small town in southern Illinois, Niebuhr was the son of a German pastor. Following his graduation from the Yale Divinity School, Niebuhr spent most of his career at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Now, what made Niebuhr so influential? Not what you might think, but the idea that Niebuhr became best known for was original sin, or rather, a very particular understanding of original sin. For in his view, the original sin was pride, not just a sort of loud and boastful pride that is fed by a love of recognition and power, but also the quieter and subtler forms of pride that often hide behind a veil of feigned humility and public charity. Now, Niebuhr worried a lot about the effects of individual pride in our personal lives, but as a political theologian, he worried even more about the effects of collective pride in our political life. And the most dangerous form of collective pride, said Niebuhr, is modern religious nationalism. What makes religious nationalism so dangerous, he said, is that it conjoins national and spiritual pride, and often race and class pride as well. Religious nationalisms are not merely idolatrous, Niebuhr warned, they are positively demonic. Demonic in the sense that they involve the invasion and possession of the self, and national spirit and of the self by a racial and national spirit that makes pretensions of divinity. Clearly, America has still not exorcised this particular demon. If anything, we are more powerfully possessed by it today than ever before. In part, I think, because we now tend to regard pride and self-love as sources of empowerment and self-esteem, rather than as sources of danger and corruption. Niebuhr's views about human nature made him rather skeptical, I should add, about some versions of secular progressivism, including Dewey's. For example, the view that education is the cure for all ills. Education is only a panacea if ignorance is the root of all evil. But what if the root of all evil is, say, pride? Then humility and contrition will be more important than knowledge and education. Niebuhr was also skeptical of the progressive vision of progress itself, not because he denied the possibility of progress, but because history does not move in straight lines. In his vision, it moves in a widening spiral. A spiral because progress is inevitably followed by regress. A widening spiral because the possibilities of human cooperation expand. As the possibilities of human cooperation expand, so do the possibilities of human oppression. Globalization can lead to new forms of solidarity, but also to new forms of exploitation. An upward spiral, finally, because the arc of history, in his view, really does bend towards justice. Of course, no account of our civic tradition would be complete without a discussion of the man responsible for that phrase, Martin Luther King. What Lincoln was to generations past, King is to ours, our greatest civic saint. A man whose words are known to every American schoolchild, whose speeches are a veritable civic catechism. King's stance towards the American project was, in fact, a lot like Lincoln's and like Niebuhr's. Highly critical, but ultimately affirming. King was fully aware of the moral rot that had spread through American society as a result of racial prejudice. But he never gave up his hope for political redemption. In his various dream speeches, for example, he often urged his followers to recover an older dream, the American dream that used to be. Not the shallow dream of material ease, but the nobler dream of human equality and national unity that had animated earlier generations of Americans. The substance of the dream, he says, is expressed in these sublime words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. King did not regard this dream as his dream alone. Echoing the Puritans, he argued that God somehow called America to do a special job for mankind in the world. Never before in the history of the world have so many racial groups and so many national backgrounds assembled together in one nation. Statement that is even truer in our days than it was in kings. And somehow, if we can't solve the problem in America, then the world can't solve the problem, because America is the world in miniature and the world is America writ large. In this sense, King was actually an American exceptionalist. His exceptionalism, however, was not the Christianist and militarist exceptionalism one finds so often today. An American exceptionalism that sees the United States as an already chosen nation, the long arm of divine justice in a godless world. Rather, it was the original exceptionalism of the Puritan era, which saw America as an almost chosen nation, a people who had chosen to set themselves apart and place themselves under a higher law. Like Winthrop, King hoped that America could serve as an example to the world, and he warned repeatedly of God's wrath should it fail. The judgment of God is upon us, he said, and we must either learn to live together as brothers, or we are all going to perish as fools. Again, words truer today than ever before. And then came the culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s. The civil religion started to unravel. There were still some veterans of the civil rights movement who kept it alive, but many on the left walked away from it. Some became technocrats, cheerleaders for globalization, preaching a gospel of growth and material prosperity. Others embraced a radical identity politics that highlighted our differences to the point of denying our commonalities. Only a few held fast. And when the secular left let the civil religion go, some on the religious right quickly seized hold of it and then thoroughly corrupted it. Jerry Falwell was certainly one of those people. For those too young to remember, he was the founder of the Moral Majority, the political arm of this nascent movement. Now, like Niebuhr, Falwell had lots to say about sin, but for him, sin was always and only individual, and it was mostly sexual. It was never collective, never social. And when Falwell denounced the sins of the people, it was almost always other people he had in mind. Never the fallen members of his own flock. Of him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his upper rooms by injustice, who makes his neighbor serve him for nothing and does not give him his wages, who says, I will build a great house with spacious upper rooms. Of this sinner, Falwell had nothing to say. And for least of these, one sometimes suspects Falwell cared nothing. In Falwell's hands, the American civil religion devolved into a reactionary form of religious nationalism. And so it remains in the hands of his son and successor, Jerry Falwell Jr., one of Donald Trump's court evangelicals. Now, I'm afraid that Ronald Reagan also played a small and subtle role in this process of corruption. He liked to quote Winthrop, or rather misquote him. For Reagan spoke of America not as a city on a hill, but as a shining city on a hill, a glittering object admired by all the world for its wealth, piety, and power. He spoke of evil too, but always and only with reference to Soviet communism. He led the American people to believe that they were good, inherently good, and the United States was great, inherently great. So far from warning about the dangers of excessive national pride, Reagan subtly encouraged them. Gone too was the traditional worry about the corrupting potentials of excessive luxury and wealth. The only real source of corruption in American life, he thought, was the state, especially the welfare state. And yet, at the close of his presidency, Reagan did have this to say of his shining city. Quote, if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get there. Reagan's civil religion was still racially inclusive, unlike the ethno-nationalism that dominates many in the Republican Party today. Now, eventually, the left did get its civil religion back, at least partly. The turning point came in July of 2004 when a skinny guy with a funny name walked onto a stage in Boston. I stand here knowing that my story is part of the larger American story, he said, that I owe a debt to all of those who came before me, and that no other country on earth is my story even possible. The greatness of our nation, he insisted, is based on a very simple premise, summed up in a declaration made over 200 years ago. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And he called on the audience to hold these shared ideals up against a hard reality and to see how we are measuring up. And he did not hesitate to give concrete examples of how we were falling short. 3.5 years later, in March of 2008, Obama walked onto another stage, this time in Philadelphia. The infamous Jeremiah Wright videos had surfaced just a few weeks before, and Obama had finally decided to face the issue head on by giving a speech on race in America. Now, there was a lot of discussion of the speech's contents, and rightly so, but what struck me at the time was the framing, which was a bit unusual. It was delivered at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, rather than, say, the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, and the opening was not taken from one of King's speeches, but rather from the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. The narrative of the speech was taken straight out of the book of Exodus. There was talk of founding covenants, the Declaration and the Constitution, of original sins, African slavery, of a people's backsliding and marching, Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement, and of a promised land that was always just over the horizon, King's beloved community. The civil religion had been torn to shreds by 3 decades of culture war, but somehow Obama had pieced it back together again, and tattered as it was, it has not lost its appeal. That much was clear from the rapturous crowds at Obama's rallies. These campaign rallies often resembled religious revivals, civil religious revivals. Alas, the new version of the civil religion was not as strong as the old. That one had been woven out of 2 threads, remember? One was the Exodus story, the story of the people who fled slavery for the promised land, who covenanted together around a shared creed, who wandered in the desert and broke the covenant, renewed the covenant, and peered over the mountaintop. That was the thread that Obama was pulling on. But there was a second thread, too, also very old, civic republicanism. Republicanism, small r, is a political ideal that goes back to ancient Greece and Rome. It's the ideal of a free and self-governing people, a people that eschews the flattery of would-be tyrants. A people, in Lincoln's words, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Obama's version of the story drew mainly on the biblical story. The Republican thread was mostly missing, and that weakened his tapestry considerably. Now, what can we still learn from this ancient, and some would say, antiquated tradition? A lot, I think. Firstly, as if we now need reminding, the democratic institutions are very, very fragile. Much more fragile than we Americans have tended to think. Asked what sort of constitution we have, Benjamin Franklin is supposed to have said, "A republic, if you can keep it." Whether we do and will remains an open question. The second lesson is that progress is not irreversible. Contemporary progressives sometimes imagine that history is like an escalator. It only moves in one direction up, and it does so without much effort. For civic Republicans, history is a bit more like a car jack. A small increment of progress requires a great deal of effort. And that upward progress can all come crashing down very quickly if someone hits the release lever. Perhaps someone already has. Third, civic Republicans know that democratic institutions are very easily corrupted. Now, today we think of corruption as quid pro quo or pay to play. And we've got plenty of that today, to be sure. But civic Republicans understood it much more broadly. That is, as putting private interests ahead of the public good, regardless of whether those interests are personal, corporate, or partisan. This, too, is pervasive, this form of corruption in our republic. Finally, civic Republicans know that self-government requires civic virtue on the part of its citizens, not in the Victorian sense of prudery or politeness, but in the ancient sense of bravery and self-sacrifice for the common good. Laws and institutions alone are not enough to preserve a republic. People must be ready to defend it. But too many of us, I worry, have forgotten these ancient truths. And that is one reason, surely not the only, that the American Republic is currently in such great peril. Probably the greatest peril that has been in since World War II. And that danger is only magnified by our present-day political polarization. Overcoming this polarization is not going to be easy. Those of us who are secular progressives might begin by recognizing the role that biblical religion has played in American history, and indeed in the history of American progressivism itself. For secular progressivism is in many ways simply a secularized version of liberal religion. Conversely, those of us who are religious conservatives need to acknowledge the influence of secular philosophy on the American founding, and indeed on American religion itself. The religious freedom that religious conservatives prize so dearly owes more than a little to Lockean liberalism, which made religious freedom the foundation of all individual rights. Having acknowledged that, we might shift our focus from, at least for a time, from the contentious issues about which we often disagree to the core values about which we mostly still agree. Equality and freedom, for example, both, of course, enshrined in our founding documents. To these two values, I would add solidarity and inclusion. Solidarity in the sense of the General Welfare Clause found in our Constitution, and inclusion in the sense of our national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one. Those, to me at least, are the four cardinal points in our civic creed: freedom, equality, inclusion, solidarity. Now, I list them in what seems to me to be their order of priority: freedom, then equality, then inclusion, and finally solidarity. But some would disagree. Some might put equality before freedom, for instance, or solidarity before inclusion. I would argue that the founders understood freedom mainly in political terms as Republican freedom, but you might disagree. Perhaps you understand freedom mainly in economic terms, namely as market freedom, or maybe you think that religious freedom is our first freedom. Now, those are actually arguments that are worth having. Some people think that the source of our problems is that we argue too much. I actually think that it's that we argue too little. Now, of course, we sometimes engage in ad hominem attacks that look like arguments, but we're simply trading insults with each other rather than reasons. At other times, we claim that one of our civic values trumps all of the others. Conservative libertarians, for example, insist that freedom of speech must have absolute priority over inclusion, over considerations of inclusion. Liberal multiculturalists, meanwhile, argue the very opposite. And neither side wants to talk about how to balance freedom and inclusion, perhaps because it's hard. Absolutism is far easier. The civil religious tradition is not going to resolve these debates for us. I don't want to pretend that it will. But it does at least tell us what we should be arguing about, namely the meaning of freedom, equality, inclusion, solidarity, and how to bring them into some measure of harmony with each other. Those are the philosophical stakes of the American experiment, that these core values can somehow be reconciled in our common life. Now, talk alone is not going to be enough. We also need to think about how to rebuild civic solidarity within the United States. For the present crisis is, amongst other things, also a crisis of solidarity. The first step in that direction might be for all of us to redirect a little bit of our time, energy, and money away from national electoral politics. We might start by investing in a place, not a virtual web 2.0 place, but a sky and earth and brick and mortar kind of place. We might continue by joining an organization, not a point and click kind of organization, but a meet and greet kind of organization, an on and demediated organization where people meet face to face, where people work together on common projects. While it's important to work within our communities, we also need to learn to work across them. Because let's face it, our communities are highly segregated, more segregated than ever before, not only by race, mind you, but now by religion and party and class and age as well. The sad, sad truth is that we are all segregationists now, even the most cosmopolitan amongst us, who often have more friends and colleagues on the other side of the world than on the other side of the tracks. These are all things that we can do as individuals on our own personal initiative to rebuild civil society. But what could we do together as a nation? Here are a few ideas. First, a renewed program of civic education. Many Americans know very little about American institutions and even less about American history. Indeed, some of our problems are due to a failure of collective memory. Why not give every American student the same civics test that every applicant for American citizenship has to pass? Why not make passing that test a condition for graduation from high school? Second, make civic holidays into holidays again. Days when people do not work and cannot shop. Days when people might talk to their neighbors or even watch a parade, as is done in many other nations around the world. And finally, make Election Day such a day, as it is in most countries. Third, more ambitiously still, institute a system of national service. Require that all young people spend a year or two doing something for their country. Join the military, clear a trail, teach a class, whatever. But no waivers and no exceptions. I could be wrong, but my guess is that most Americans would support most of these measures. But unfortunately, like a lot of things that ordinary Americans support, it's kind of hard to imagine them becoming law. In part because our political system is so thoroughly corrupted and polarized that nothing meaningful gets done. Now, the main source of this corruption is obvious. We all know what it is. It's money, the endless flow of influence money. When 5 of the 10 richest counties in the United States are in the Washington, D.C. area, you know that something is seriously wrong. I know that we can't completely stop the flow of money into politics. Money is like water, but that doesn't mean that we can't slow the flow. As for our polarization, the political parties are as much to blame as the culture warriors. Using big data and statistical analysis, the two parties have carved up the United States to their own advantage. As a result of this increasingly sophisticated gerrymandering, most congressional districts are now safe districts. And this means that most incumbents are far more worried about primary challengers from the fringe of their own party than they are about electoral challengers from the other party. This would be easy enough to fix if everyone just followed Arizona's lead and put redistricting into the hand of an independent bipartisan commission. Candidates would then be forced to run towards the center instead of towards the fringes. Now, of course, not everyone is going to be interested in fixing the republic. Some, a small handful, after all, are profiting handsomely from its demise and squirreling away the proceeds in faraway places. Others, a growing number, I'm afraid, are determined to win the current partisan battles by any means necessary, democratic or not. Still others, probably the largest group, are so disgusted that they've simply turned away from politics. Now, where does that leave us? Well, I think it leaves a lot of us, actually, enough to turn things around if we were to pull together, as long as we're willing to listen to the better angels of our shared history. Those of us who are still committed to making ours a nation of nations and a people of peoples, a flourishing multi-ethnic democracy. That, after all, is the American experiment, an intergenerational experiment whose outcome is still unknown and still important. For the eyes of the world really are still upon us, and more than a few would like to see us fail, not just because they hate our freedom, though of course some really do, but also because they despise our diversity. They wager that it is not possible to make a democratic people out of many peoples, an inclusive nation out of many nations. I wager that they are wrong, and I hope that you do too, so that America may be America again, a land that's never been, but a land that still must be. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Horns of a Dilemma. Be sure to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.